Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest stories of betrayal and tragedy. Today, we dive into a chilling tale of family secrets and a deadly affair that ended in catastrophe. Ethan had always considered his brother Jacob his closest confidant. They shared everything growing up: dreams, challenges, and even their love for family. Their bond was unbreakable, and when Jacob married Camilla, Ethan couldn't help but feel pleased for him. Camilla was kind and welcoming, someone who fit seamlessly into their family dynamic. She had a teenage daughter named Isla from her previous marriage, and though Isla was a little more reserved, there was something about her that intrigued Ethan. Isla was 15, soft-spoken, and beautiful in a way that seemed to draw people in without her even trying. At first, Ethan brushed it off as nothing more than a passing admiration. Isla was family now, and he couldn't let himself think of her in any other way. Still, he noticed the differences between her and his own wife, Sandra. Sandra was constantly demanding, always needing attention, and never satisfied with anything. Their marriage had become a series of unspoken grievances and unmet expectations. Ethan loved Sandra, but he often found himself frustrated with their relationship, which seemed to lack the warmth and connection it once had. It wasn't long before Ethan found himself thinking about Isla more than he should. At family gatherings, he'd find himself watching her from a distance. She had a quiet grace, an innocence that reminded him of the younger days in his own life, back before things became complicated. Isla had an air of vulnerability, and he couldn't help but feel a strange pull whenever she was near. The way she moved, the way she smiled, it all seemed so effortless, unlike the constant strain in his marriage. One summer afternoon, they were all gathered at Jacob and Camilla's house for a barbecue. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the backyard. Ethan found himself alone with Isla, who was sitting on the porch swing, her head resting against the back. She looked serene, lost in thought. Ethan hesitated but decided to sit next to her, the conversation drifting from one topic to the next. They spoke casually about their lives. Ethan, his struggles with Sandra, and Isla, who talked about school and her dreams for the future. It was an easy conversation, one that felt comfortable in a way that Ethan hadn't experienced in a long time. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself sitting beside her more frequently, sharing quiet moments when the others weren't around. He noticed how her laughter seemed to cut through the tension that always lingered in his home. The more time they spent together, the more Ethan couldn't ignore the undeniable connection he felt toward her. It was dangerous, he knew. She was family now, and he had a wife, a life that was supposed to come first. But the attraction was growing stronger with every encounter. One evening, as they stood alone by the edge of the garden, Isla turned to Ethan with a look he couldn't quite interpret. Her gaze lingered for a moment too long before she quickly turned away. Ethan's heart raced. He had been so careful, so diligent about keeping his emotions in check. But now, as he looked at Isla, he realized that the boundaries he had set were no longer as clear. He was drawn to her in a way he hadn't been in years, perhaps in a way he hadn't even known he was capable of feeling. It was then that Ethan understood that something had shifted, and no matter how hard he tried to deny it, he was becoming entangled in a web of his own making. He knew he should stop, that what he was feeling was wrong, but it felt too late to turn back now. As weeks passed, Ethan found himself caught in a whirlwind of guilt and desire. The affair with Isla, which had begun innocently, quickly escalated. What had started as an occasional glance or a casual touch between them grew more intense, more frequent. Ethan tried to convince himself it was a temporary lapse, a brief escape from the suffocating reality of his marriage. But as the days wore on, the lines between right and wrong blurred. They found themselves sneaking away during family gatherings, stealing moments alone when no one was paying attention. Their stolen kisses became more urgent, their secret meetings more daring. At first, it was easy for Ethan to justify it. He told himself it was only temporary, that it wouldn't last. But every time he was with Isla, the connection deepened. Her presence, so innocent and captivating, seemed to draw him in like a moth to a flame. Ethan tried to remind himself that he was betraying not only his wife, but also his brother. Yet every time Isla was near, the rational thoughts in his head were drowned out by his desire for her. Isla, too, seemed to welcome the attention. She had been distant and quiet at first, but now she responded with equal passion, teasing and flirting in subtle ways. Her behavior began to change. She started seeking out Ethan's company more frequently, and the way she looked at him, almost daring, yet still shy, made his heart race. It was clear that she was just as consumed by the affair as he was. She would look up at him with those wide, innocent eyes, and Ethan felt as though he could drown in them. Each stolen moment felt like a victory, but also a step further into dangerous territory. Their secret became harder to keep. They couldn't go long without exchanging a look, a touch, something that revealed the growing tension between them. At family events, Ethan began to feel the weight of every glance, every shared laugh, as if everyone could see through the facade. But no one said anything. The guilt gnawed at him, but the thrill of the affair was intoxicating. It was a forbidden love, something he never thought he would experience, but now that it had begun, it consumed him. It was at one of the family barbecues when Ethan realized just how much things had changed. He and Isla found themselves in a secluded corner of the backyard, away from the prying eyes of their relatives. The air was warm, but the tension between them was palpable. They talked casually at first, about nothing in particular, but the energy between them was undeniable. Ethan could feel the pulse of anticipation in the air as Isla inched closer to him. He could smell the faint scent of her perfume, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The moment their lips met, it felt like everything Ethan had been holding back came crashing to the surface. It was no longer just a fleeting attraction, it was something more, something dangerous and irreversible. They kissed in the shadows, hidden from the world, their hands roaming as if they were the only two people alive in that moment. The world outside felt distant, and for that brief moment Ethan allowed himself to be lost in it. But even as he surrendered to the thrill of it, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that he was playing with fire. He knew the risks. He knew that sooner or later the truth would come out. But for now the excitement was too much to resist. He was caught in a spiral, unable to stop, even as the danger loomed closer with every passing day. It wasn't just the affair that was unraveling. Ethan's entire life was beginning to crack under the weight of his secret. The excitement he once felt had faded into a constant undercurrent of tension. With every passing day, the guilt became harder to bear. He couldn't look at his wife Sandra without feeling a pang of shame, yet he couldn't stay away from Isla. The affair had become a force of its own, pulling him deeper into a world of deception that seemed impossible to escape. Isla, once shy and reserved, began to change. She became bolder, her actions more calculated. She no longer waited for Ethan to initiate their secret meetings. Instead, she found ways to draw him in, her body language now purposeful and seductive. It was as though she had embraced the affair fully, and in doing so, she pushed Ethan further into a corner. Her behavior was reckless, and the thrill that had once been intoxicating began to feel like a dangerous game with no clear rules. The tension wasn't limited to just Ethan and Isla. Sandra, ever perceptive, started to notice changes in his behavior. Ethan found himself withdrawing more and more from her, retreating into himself when he used to be open. Sandra began asking questions, probing him about his moods, his late nights, his unexplained absences. Ethan brushed it off at first, offering half-hearted excuses. But the questions kept coming, and with each one he felt a rising panic in his chest. He could see the doubt in Sandra's eyes, the way she would glance at him, unsure and searching for answers. Then there was Jacob. His brother had always been loyal, a pillar in Ethan's life. But now Ethan felt the weight of that loyalty crushing him. Jacob had started to notice the distance between him and his wife Camila. Their marriage, once solid and full of affection, had started to show signs of strain. Camila was often quiet now, her eyes clouded with suspicion. She had always been intuitive, and Ethan knew that she, too, could sense that something was off. But she never asked, never confronted him directly. It was as though she was waiting for him to confess, for him to reveal the truth. The guilt ate away at him, knowing that he was the cause of the unraveling of both his marriage and his brother's. One evening, after an awkward dinner with the family, Isla's behavior became even more erratic. She no longer cared about being discreet, no longer seemed to mind who saw them together. Her flirtations became more blatant, and Ethan could sense the danger in the air. There were moments when she would look at him with a challenging gaze, daring him to acknowledge the affair openly. Ethan knew they were walking a fine line, but Isla didn't seem to care. The thrill of secrecy had worn off for her, and now she seemed determined to push the boundaries even further. At the same time, the distance between Ethan and Sandra grew more pronounced. She had become suspicious, though she never directly confronted him about it. Instead, she withdrew into herself, filling the silence with passive-aggressive remarks and bitter glares. Ethan could feel the growing gap between them, but he couldn't find a way to close it. His emotional and physical energy was drained, caught between his obligations to his wife and the irresistible pull of his affair with Isla. Ethan tried to pretend that nothing had changed, but every moment felt like a lie. The cracks in his life were becoming more visible, the consequences of his actions inevitable. It was no longer just about his relationship with Isla. It was about the unraveling of everything he had once held dear. The pressure mounted, and he could no longer ignore the reality that sooner or later everything would come crashing down. The walls were closing in, and Ethan had no idea how to stop the destruction that had already begun. One evening, after weeks of mounting tension, the truth came crashing down. It all started with a seemingly ordinary family dinner, where the air was thick with unspoken questions. Jacob had noticed his wife Camilla's growing unease and, in turn, the strain it was putting on their marriage. There were no words spoken aloud, but it was clear to everyone in the room that things weren't the same. Jacob, who had always been the more reserved of the two brothers, began to question the subtle changes he had seen in Ethan. He had noticed Ethan's distant gaze, the way he avoided contact with everyone. Something was off, but Jacob couldn't put his finger on it. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to more personal matters. Sandra, her suspicions growing, noticed the tension between her husband and Isla, who seemed to linger around Ethan more than usual. It was becoming more apparent that something was wrong. The small gestures, the lingering looks, the accidental touches, they weren't just figments of Sandra's imagination. She had seen them, and now she couldn't unsee them. In the dim light of the kitchen, Jacob finally confronted his brother. The confrontation, fueled by mounting frustration and confusion, was quiet but explosive. He confronted Ethan directly, his voice low but full of accusation. "What's going on, Ethan? What is this between you and Isla?" The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no escaping the inevitable. Isla, overhearing the exchange, stood frozen in the hallway. The shock on her face mirrored Ethan's, and for the first time she seemed to realize the full weight of their secret. She had been caught, and there was no hiding from the truth now. Her pulse raced as Jacob turned toward her, his eyes blazing with betrayal. He had known something was wrong for a while, but hearing it spoken aloud, seeing it unfold before him, was too much to bear. Ethan tried to explain himself, but the words were empty. There was no justification for the affair, no excuse that could mend the rift between him and his brother. In the heat of the moment, Jacob's anger flared. His face reddened with fury, and in a blind, impulsive act, he reached for something nearby, anything to express the rage that had built up over time. Isla, standing in the doorway, instinctively stepped back, as though she could somehow escape the consequences of their actions. But there was no escaping now. Ethan and Jacob were in a fierce struggle, each one trying to make sense of what had happened, but it was clear that the damage was irreparable. In the chaos, Jacob's anger reached a boiling point. The fight escalated quickly, and before anyone could react, Jacob's frustration led to a fatal act. In that split second, everything changed. What had once been an angry confrontation became something far more violent, far more destructive. The tragedy unfolded in mere moments. As the confrontation reached its peak, Jacob, unable to control his emotions, acted out of sheer rage. The blow that landed was decisive, and Ethan's body crumpled to the ground. Time seemed to slow down in that instant, and what had been an argument, a moment of long-awaited confrontation, turned into an irreversible tragedy. Isla stood frozen, horrified by what had just happened. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of heavy breathing and the weight of a life lost. Jacob stood over Ethan, his body trembling as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. He had gone too far. The anger, the betrayal, the years of frustration, all of it had built up into this one moment, and now it was too late to take any of it back. The aftermath of that night was one of shock and disbelief. The family, once so close-knit, was shattered beyond repair. Jacob, now consumed with guilt, could barely comprehend what he had done. Isla, caught in the web of deceit and violence, was left in a state of shock, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. The consequences of their actions had led to a place no one had ever imagined, and nothing could undo the damage done. The days that followed the tragedy were filled with a heavy silence, each moment a reminder of the irrevocable choices that had been made. The family, once bound together by love and trust, now stood divided by betrayal and loss. Ethan's death had shaken them all to their core, but the aftermath proved to be just as destructive as the act itself. Jacob, racked with guilt, found himself unable to face the consequences of his actions. He stayed holed up in his home, unable to reconcile the brother he had once loved with the violent act he had committed. Isla, too, was trapped in the suffocating grip of guilt and fear. The affair, which had seemed thrilling and dangerous, was now a dark, tragic memory. She hadn't planned for it to end this way. She hadn't meant for it to spiral out of control, but now, standing in the shadow of Ethan's death, she realized the depth of her involvement in the destruction of everything she had once known. She was no longer just a teenager with an innocent crush. She was a participant in something far more sinister, something that would follow her for the rest of her life. For Sandra, the loss of her husband was devastating, but it was compounded by the knowledge of his betrayal. The affair, which had once been an unknown, was now exposed in the most tragic way imaginable. Sandra's grief was complicated by a simmering rage that she couldn't shake. She mourned the man she had loved, but she also despised the man who had betrayed her. She couldn't understand how Ethan, the man she had shared her life with, could have done this to her, to their family. The pain of his death was unbearable, but the deeper wound was the betrayal she had endured. Jacob's actions haunted him day and night. He couldn't escape the image of Ethan's lifeless body, the blood that stained the floor. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again, the struggle, the fury, the fatal blow. He had never imagined that his anger could lead to something so irreversible. But now, it was too late. The weight of what he had done crushed him, leaving him paralyzed in his own guilt. The investigation into Ethan's death was inevitable. Neighbors, friends, and family all began to whisper about what had happened. The story, once an intimate secret, was now out in the open, and the consequences were far-reaching. Jacob, desperate to avoid facing the full extent of his actions, tried to distance himself from the truth, but it was clear that the law wouldn't let him escape. He was arrested, charged with manslaughter. The authorities found evidence that suggested the altercation had been more than just a moment of heated words. It had been a violent, reckless outburst fueled by years of tension, jealousy, and anger. As the legal proceedings began, the family was torn apart by the public scrutiny of their lives. The tragedy that had begun with a secret affair had spiraled into a criminal investigation that left everyone involved shattered. Camilla, caught in the center of it all, was left to pick up the pieces of her broken family. She had lost her husband to violence, and her daughter to a life of shame and regret. There was no going back, no undoing the events that had led them to this point. Isla, now alone in the wake of everything that had happened, was left to reflect on the choices that had brought her to this place. The affair, the betrayal, the tragedy. It had all been driven by her own desires, her own misplaced feelings. She had thought she could escape the consequences, but now the weight of her actions was clear. There was no way to reverse the damage that had been done. The affair had cost her the life of someone she once cared for, the trust of a family she had once been a part of, and the future she had hoped for. As the years passed, the pain of the tragedy never truly went away. The family, forever marked by the events that had torn them apart, could never return to the life they had once known. The consequences of Ethan's affair with Isla, of Jacob's violent outburst, and of the lies they had all told remained with them. Each one carried the weight of that night in their hearts, knowing that no matter what they did, the tragedy would forever define them.